Hello and welcome to Beyond the News. I'm your host, Muhammad ASAD. In tonight's edition of the program, we will be discussing a year-in review for national and international events, a closer look at the national team's sporting performances. But first, let's take a look at years in review in terms of politics. The year 2018 has now come to its conclusion, but it is important to take a look back at the major political events that stunned and grasped the attention of the nation. 2018 was a historic year because it marked the third consecutive democratic transition of power in the nation's 71-year history. Imran Khan's astute vision to create a welfare state for all Pakistanis resonated with the adult suffrage who voted for him in majority, but it was also an election marred by violence and calls of unequal level playing field for dominant national parties. Pakistan also witnessed its deadliest terror attack since 2014, when a suicide bomber targeted an election campaign in Mastung, Balochistan, killing 149 people and injuring 180. The most affected party heading into the election was PMLN, as former Premier Nawaz Sharif and his daughter Maryam Nawaz, who favored her chances of winning a seat, were both sentenced to jail in the Evanfield verdict by an accountability court. About 2 months later, they were released on parole for 5 days after Begum Kulsoom Nawaz passed away. 2 days after they were shifted back to Adiala jail at the end of their parole period, the Islamabad High Court suspended the sentences given to Nawaz, Maryam and Captain Safdar, releasing them on bail. Just a few days before July 25th polls, another PMLN leader, Hanif Abbasi, was arrested and charged in connection to the ephedrine case. After the assembly started its procedure, the House recognized Shehbaz Sharif as the leader of the opposition. However, in October, Shehbaz was also arrested by the National Accountability Bureau in connection to the Ashiana housing scam. Shehbaz is still currently in jail, getting some leeway to attend important National Assembly sessions. The message for accountability for all is seen by opposition parties as a way for the PTI government to assert its authoritative stance, targeting only specific leaders of PMLN and Pakistan People's Party while protecting their own stalwarts. One of the biggest money laundering scams was unearthed by the Federal Investigation Agency, which led to the implication of 172 names, including Pakistan People's Party co-chairman Asif Zardari and his sister Faryal Talpur. Chairman of Omni Group Anwar Majid, who is also said to be a close aide of Asif Zardari, is also nominated in the case along with his sons. Former Railways Minister and PMLN's firebrand Saad Rafiq and his brother Khwaja Salman Rafiq were also arrested in connection to the Paragon Housing Society scam. Both are currently in NAB's custody on physical remand. Supreme Court of Pakistan emerged as the most powerful institution due to the Chief Justice of Pakistan, Mia Saqib Nisar's proactive efforts to resolve pending issues and take note of a ticking time bomb, that being the depleting water resources of the country and the essential need to create the Diamir Bhasha Mohammed Dam Fund. Politics was somehow both overly theatrical yet ordinary for Pakistan in the year 2018. And to further review the year, we now join Mr. Muhammad Ziauddin, senior analyst. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Ziauddin.
Thank you.
Now, sir, how significant was the year 2018 when it comes to a successful democratic transition?
Well, as you said, yes, it was a very highly successful transition, democratic transition. This is the third time that an elected government has come in, and a government which lost the elections handed over the powers to the elected new coming in government. So that way, yes, it was a highly significant and a very positive development. But as you know, that elections are rather disruptive. So that disruption has come in during the 2018 year throughout the year, since before the election, the pre-election period and then post-election period, handing over, taking over. And since the new government is almost like a new entrant, it has never been in the government. So, their handling of the entire situation has been wanting. So that way, yes, it was a very highly disruptive year. And then the Chief Justice proactive, actions, especially his use of suo motu powers, has added to the disruption. Obviously, the judiciary, the interest of the judiciary is to bring in just give a judicial, environment in the country. But then the way he handled he approached the entire issue actually added to the disruption. And that way, both the election, post-election, pre-election, and the approach of the judiciary had added to the disruption. And then the economic situation has been, as you pointed out, was not very conducive. So, the current account of deficit was very high, debt was very high, and the new government, since it was totally inexperienced about these issues, attempted to rather overcome the situation, but then it was perhaps helped by the military. It was perhaps the army which helped it to get about $3 billion from the Saudi Arabia and the UAE, another $3 billion oil on deferred payment. And the Chinese were already, they being the interested party in the CPEC, came to aid the new government. It was not because of the new government, but because of the environment around in the situation, which appeared to have created a situation where the government appears to be in a position to talk to IMF at an equal level. Expecting again that IMF would not put severe conditions.
When we talk about the July 25th general elections, the events that actually surrounded the elections were also contentious. Do you think that parties like PMLN or Pakistan People's Party had rightful concerns about rigging and selective accountability?
Well, yes. There was perhaps not much of a rigging on the polling day, but if you recall the pre-poll atmosphere in the country, it appeared, like the cases against the ruling party, against the prime minister, his family, and even some of the major leaders. There was this, perception that the main political party has been, a situation was created to create a number of hurdles in the way of PMLN before the elections were even held, and a number of PMLN PPP leaders, changed their loyalties, creating a situation, creating an environment or perception that some unknown forces are forcing these electables to leave their original parties and go to PTI, so that the PTI's winning chances, and then the perception, the entire public, that this is the party which is going to get elected. So that way, yes, there was this perception, and then there was a post-election, rigging as well, because of the arrest of the major leader of the opposition. And then there's now the attack on the People's Party and this leadership. It all creates the perception that some forces are trying to create an environment easier for the PTI to rule without any threats from the opposition. As it is, if you look in the parliament, the PTI's numbers are very low, and that again perhaps is the reason why the forces inimical to democracy are trying to create a situation where the opposition would not be able to threaten the government, the incumbent government, both at the center as well as in Punjab.
Now, well, you've already shed some light about the PTI-led government's performance so far. Now, will 2019 prove to be a challenging year for his government, for Imran Khan's government, considering that PTI, as you already mentioned, has alienated both Pakistan People's Party and PMLN?
Well, the measure of its success would be how successful it is in creating an environment where economically the people of Pakistan feel that they are not under pressure. But already a new finance bill is supposed to be announced next month, and already there are reports that some more taxes are to be imposed. Already the gas rates and electricity rates have gone up, and if the prices go up, the rate of inflation goes up, there will be a problem for especially the indigent people, the poor people, the middle classes. And then it will take some time for the new government to handle these economic challenges. We would need to give them at least about a year or so. But then again, the direction so far has not been very clear. Where do they want to go? I mean, they talk about the state of Medina. There is a social welfare state. But if you look at the real situation, we are a security state. We are still in a state of war against say, India, against Afghanistan, and we have not a very good relations on the borders of Iran. And then there is this hybrid war to be fought, and then the terrorism. These are 4 or 5 kinds of war fronts. You don't fight these wars on empty pockets. You need to have money. How do you collect that money? There is no any signal that this new government has started reforming the taxation system. So there are a number of reports in the Planning Commission, and even about 3 years back, there was a comprehensive report on how to reform the taxation system. But I'm not very sure that this government has even looked at that report. If it had looked at this report, perhaps it would have gone to broaden tax base. So far, it has not done it. So that way, yes, socially, yes, they are creating, establishing houses for indigent people in number of cities. But that's a drop in the bucket. There is so massive poverty. I mean, even if you look at the numbers, the official numbers, there is about 33 to 35% of people who are living under the poverty line.
Now, talking about the foreign affairs front, how significant has been the role of Foreign Office led by Shah Mahmood Qureshi? Is Pakistan's message to peace and solidarity finally reaching to other countries, or will this image building and confidence building process finally result in some favorable relations?
Well, I mean, it all looks to me very highly cosmetic, because just before this election, in the 2017, the state appeared to be very unhappy with the way the government was trying to create a kind of normalcy with India, or create a kind of a normalcy with Afghanistan, or even create a situation through the Foreign Office, an atmosphere for peace to be restored in Afghanistan. Suddenly, after the election, the way the state is behaving looks to me as if under pressure or for some short-term reasons, they want to create an atmosphere as if the state and the government both of them are interested in having good relations with India and creating a peace settlement in Afghanistan. But then I don't think it is a lasting kind of a thing which the state has adopted.
Thank you very much for joining us. That was senior journalist Mr. Ziauddin. He was discussing and reviewing AIR 2018 in terms of national politics. And it's time now for a short break. We'll be back with more stories. Welcome back after the break. Moving on to our next story, that would be 2018 in review in terms of international. 2018 has not been an easy year in many ways, and in a world where President Donald Trump leads the charge of the supposed free world, diplomacy feels like a strange affair due to constant recanting and rebuking of statements and knowledge. The headlines have also been unrelentingly bleak. Perhaps one should not have underestimated Donald Trump's idiosyncrasies, which eventually led to the Trump-Kim summit in Singapore, where he met North Korea's Kim Jong-un, making history in turn. They signed an agreement reaffirming Pyongyang's commitment to the complete denuclearization of the Korean peninsula. So far, however, North Korea has only taken few concrete steps to abandon its nuclear weapons, and the two sides have argued over the meaning of the vaguely worded agreement. The United States also shocked the world with its abrupt change in narrative towards the Israel-Palestine conflict. In the month of May, United States opened its new embassy in Jerusalem amid protests and clashes that led to the deaths of more innocent Palestinians. While Africa is often overlooked, a significant breakthrough came in the form of peace process between Eritrea and Ethiopia. The two countries announced the end of the two-decade-old war and established communication links for the first time alongside their border. Nothing might be more bizarre than the news regarding Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi's disappearance and the subsequent updates that confirm that he was in fact killed inside the Saudi consulate in Turkey. On December 13, the U.S. Senate adopted a resolution holding Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman responsible despite vehement denials from Riyadh. The South America's biggest country, touted to be one of the biggest democracies, Brazilians headed to the polls this year to elect Jair Bolsonaro, a far-right leader who does not believe in climate change and thinks that the solution to drug wars is to arm citizens with more firepower. The threat of populism did not remain in weak democracies. In fact, far-right parties and candidates made headways in European countries as well. Hungary's Viktor Orban continued to indulge in anti-migrant rhetoric while empowering fascists in the country. Talking about Italy, a populist coalition government takes power formed by the anti-establishment Five-Star Movement and far-right anti-migrant Eurosceptic League. Leader of the League, Interior Minister Matteo Salvini also introduced a hardline immigration policy, largely closing Italy's borders to migrants. In Middle East, civilians in both Yemen and Syria suffered due to the deliberate policies of the world leaders. Yemen's crisis in particular in the sense that the United States-backed Saudi coalition scarred the country by untimely civil war. 22 million people are dependent on humanitarian aid, which is still blocked by the controlling forces in some areas. Now there is some renewed hope that the conflict might end with UN brokering a ceasefire deal in Sweden between Houthi forces and Saudi Arabia. Despite all the negative news, it is important to take good things into perspective for a larger picture. As made clear in 2018 by various studies, extreme poverty is declining throughout the world. More and more people have access to electricity, and child mortality is equally declining due to better health care. Now, to talk more about the international affairs in 2018, we now join Dr. Syed Muhammad Ali, Adjunct Assistant Professor at Georgetown University. So, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, sir, it has been nearly 2 years since President Trump has been in office. How do you see his impact on global international affairs? Is there no place for element of surprise with Trump being in power?
Well, I mean, he has been erratic politically, not only domestically. I mean, domestically, one feels the increasing polarity within the political environment in the U.S., but of course internationally as well. You know, I mean, I was hearing you sort of highlight some of the major issues in the last year, and another big thing, you know, was of course the Paris Agreement on climate change. And domestically, we've seen the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, now get someone who has, you know, has had close ties with the coal lobby, you know, and essentially a very disgruntled attitude towards environmental issues. And internationally, the U.S. has pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement, and of course, climate change. You know, the Pentagon itself a couple of years ago had identified climate change, they dubbed it as as a threat multiplier, meaning that wherever there is tension, you know, around the world, you will see an exacerbation a worsening of that tension because of like resource strains. I mean, look at, for instance, in the Indian subcontinent, where we are sharing, at the upper level, India sharing its waters of the Indus with Pakistan, and then also sharing waterways with Bangladesh. So at the regional level in Africa, of course, you have similar kinds of arrangements. And what is the global mechanism now? I mean, the Paris Agreement, it had taken a lot of time, to cobble that together. Then, of course, I mean, at the trade level, we've seen also, these kind of isolationist policies and trying to broker new deals. So I mean, there's been a lot of turbulence, if you will, because of the U.S. role in international politics.
Now, sir, while the United States has pulled out the Iranian nuclear deal, it made great strides towards reconciliation with North Korea. Now, how do you see the impact of both of these events? Is the axis of evil a forgotten concept that has no place in today's world?
I mean, the axis of evil, I mean, is a creative term, and unfortunately, rather than having, as we've walked now firmly into the new millennium, rather than having a more nuanced understanding, I mean, we see in the world like these increasingly populist, crude ways of looking at the world, black and white ways of looking at the world, where we then create these demonizations of the other. And we see that in Europe, in the US, we see that in our part of the world. Yes, on the one hand, I mean, it was interesting, despite a lot of cynicism within the establishment in the US, President Trump thought that, with his art of the deal, he can go and do something substantive in the Korean standoff. And while he met, with Kim Jong-il, there might have, in fact, the interesting developments that have taken place are within the Koreas themselves, because the South Korean leadership had actually won, their elections on this idea of reconciliation, and we've seen a much more robust and a much more sustained back and forth between the two Koreas. Whereas the U.S. engagement, and President Trump's rather obtuse statements about denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, we haven't seen that much empirical evidence, and there's a criticism, of his having engaged at the highest level without really having, on ground movement towards that kind of reconciliation. And conversely, on the other hand, there were a lot of people saying that, the deal with Iran was a step in the right direction. And it would, have a rollback effect, not only in Iran and creating more resentment within Iran against the US for having backpedaled on this major international accomplishment, but then that also has carryover effect, in the situation in Syria, in the situation in Yemen, and generally in the Middle East.
Talking about Brexit, Brexit also dominated a news cycle with March 29 set as the final deadline. Now, do you think that the Brexit withdrawal agreement is best deal possible with the European Union in the given time frame?
Well, Brexit is, I mean, it's created, I mean, in retrospect, it's created a lot of doublethink, if you will, within Great Britain, and, vis-a-vis the situation in Ireland. I mean, it's become a very complex deal. So how it was presented to the people was different to now how it's playing out, and them, thinking that they could have all the goodies of integration, regional integration, and be able to, set aside their membership in the European Commission and the European Union, was now that's proving to be quite a challenge. And there are people who are kind of regretting, this idea of Brexit. But there's also a further complexity around the idea of Brexit, and how the idea of Brexit was sold to the people, in Europe was as this kind of anti-immigration idea. This idea that the old glory days of Britain, are being constrained, and Britain can regain its former glories by, exiting this larger regional framework and going and standing alone. And of course, those old glory days were very problematic, because what were those old glory days? Those old glory days were days of colonialism, right? When African countries, our part of the world, Latin America, lesser of Latin America, were subjected to, a very exploitative, mechanism, right? Which has, we're still bearing the brunt of that old glory of Great Britain.
Now, so one last question before we wrap up this insightful conversation. Now, the democracies around the world have shown a regressive trend due to the rise of far-right candidates and parties. Now, is the world ready to deal with the challenges of populism, particularly European Union, which has done little to keep such things in check?
It's kind of upsetting, this populist appeal, and we're hearing a lot about this, in Europe, and you're absolutely right in your initial analysis. Places like Italy, the far right is also making a comeback now in Germany with, in Ursula, with the German premier sort of now having to, she's been in power for long enough. Besides Germany and Italy, there's Hungary. There's of course the populism within the US, but also in our part of the world, right? You look at the populist dimensions here. You look at what's going on in India. You look at what's going on in our own country. So, how these forces of populism, because ultimately, at the end of the day, the unfortunate thing with populism is that, it taps into genuine sentiment of people who are kind of feeling deprived and kind of feeling left behind, with stagnating incomes and this, that, the other. And it gives them this kind of, this sense of the other, that the other is at fault. And it's kind of ludicrous, where, people in the American Midwest, workers who have seen, they don't see that land of opportunity that, the rest of the world thinks about. And they are frustrated. And now their frustration, is not turned towards, people who are earning, salaries in the millions of dollars within the US. Their frustrations are turned against the blue-collar worker in Mexico, the blue-collar, the garment worker in Bangladesh, right, who have stolen their jobs, right? And how have they stolen their jobs, right? You look at the Bangladeshi garment worker, how much does the Bangladeshi garment worker make? Right? So the idea is that, our jobs have gone abroad and China's stealing our jobs, this, that, the other. But essentially, this is a problem with populism, right? Or it's the fear of the other, of the migrant, right? So, and this is not only a phenomena of the Western world. This is also a phenomena in our part of the world, where we have these kind of majoritarian assertions, and one does feel disappointed that here we are ending 2018 and we have nanotechnology and we have deep space probes and all types of scientific advances and communication technologies, and we can't even understand these very basic problems, and public sentiment gets manipulated like it does.
Thank you very much for joining us. That was Dr. Syed Muhammad Ali, Adjunct Assistant Professor at Georgetown University. He was discussing about Air 2018 on international level, discussing about the mega events that unfolded during last year. And it's time now for a short break. We'll be back with more stories. Welcome back after the break. Moving on to our last segment of today's program, Year in Review in terms of sports. Now, 2018 proved to be yet another thrilling and enticing year for world sports. For Pakistan, the year 2018 in sports was a mixed bag, considering that most of the focus had been put on cricket, and the team did not deliver in the Test and ODIs as well as it did in the T20s. In the 2020 version of the cricket, Pakistan had a different way of playing altogether. All in all, the team won 17 out of total 19 T20 matches, making them number 1 in the ICC T20 rankings. But extending the format to 50 overs cricket, and Pakistan once again displayed serious troubles in terms of team selection and consistent performances. Pakistan won only a solitary ODI all-year against teams other than Hong Kong, Afghanistan or Zimbabwe. Now, going into the Asia Cup, Pakistan were the favourites to win the tournament due to UAE being their home turf for nearly a decade. But brittle batting and alarming captaincy resulted in an overall lackluster performance that the team would like to forget about. Now, Pakistan also started on a good note this year's Test cricket, winning against Ireland and then drawing the series 1-1 against England at their home. Pakistan could have played better against both Australia and New Zealand, considering they were playing at the UAE stadiums. We will not be able to forget the uncanny Azhar Ali run out when he wavered mid-pitch to talk to Asad Shafiq while the ball was still active. Similarly, Azhar Ali was also involved in another historic occasion when Pakistan were defeated by New Zealand by just 4 runs, and that too in a test match. There have been few changes in the management structure of the PCB, with Ehsan Mani coming in as new appointee of the Imran Khan's government. Mani also appointed Wasim Khan as the managing director, who has promised to overhaul the domestic structure of cricket to make it more competitive. The PCB also lost an important legal battle against BCCI, for which the ICC committee announced that the Pakistan board will now have to pay its Indian counterpart around 60% of legal expenses. The hockey team did not fare well in much of the international tournaments, although the team is ending with an improvement in overall FIH ranking. It is now 12 instead of 13. There are financial concerns looming over Pakistan Hockey Federation, and the General Secretary Shahbaz Senior recently resigned from his post, citing government's reluctance to care about the national sports. Now, to further discuss the year in sports, we now join Mr. Umar Ghaznavi, sports analyst. Thank you very much for joining us, Umar.
My pleasure, Asad.
Now, Umar, 2018 was not as good as 2017 for Pakistan cricket. What went wrong for Pakistan in 50-over cricket after first winning a Champions Trophy last year?
Well, look, the thing is that we tend to overestimate how good our team was in ODI cricket. Pakistan have been quite poor in limited overs cricket, even during the Misbah and Yunus Khan era. We struggled against most teams, even the mediocre sides at best. And we were, if you remember, when we headed into the Champions Trophy, we were ranked the lowest in the entire tournament. So I think it's a little early to jump on that and say that the Pakistan team is struggling in ODIs. We've actually made a couple of points and gone up to 5th place in ODIs. We're number 1 in T20. And from at least a positive perspective for 2019, I'd say that we have a very young T20 side that plays aggressive cricket, and I think that will translate into more positive results in the ODI format over the coming year. You have to give the team a little bit of time to mature. Test cricket, totally different ballgame, unfortunately, and I think Pakistan will struggle for a while yet, because replacing almost 18,000 runs in between Yunus Khan and Misbah Haq, who left at the same time, it's not easy to replace players like that. And these are the words of our own coach, Mickey Arthur. So we have to give this team a little bit of time. It's very young, still quite raw when it comes to the longer formats. But the encouraging thing is that Pakistan has been the dominant force in T20 cricket so far in 2018. And they look to continue that dominance in 2019.
Well, I agree with your analysis that Pakistan have been the top T20 side in the world, but still, I still have that question, like why haven't the team been able to deliver in other formats? I mean, you have already mentioned about it, but I still want to dig more into it.
Look, I said the thing is that in the longer format, especially Test cricket, your players, especially the younger players that are coming through, our domestic structure is notoriously poor. We've always struggled with it. It's nothing new. We've always dependent on raw talent being found and then honed into becoming a international player. However, to hone a player to become a Test cricketer is a totally different ballgame. And I'll tell you one of the things that's the most alarming for me. You mentioned other sports and how Pakistan fared. What's scarier is the fact that everybody just tends to pay attention to cricket alone. Now, our national sport is hockey. It's going down the drain. I mean, our improvement in ranking, which you mentioned, is marginal. And really, the performance of our team when it comes up against any of the big sides has been quite poor. So what you have to see is that most Pakistani sports, and I'll include football in this as well, because football's been a disaster, not just last year, but throughout. They need structural change. The PCB is talking about structural change, and that doesn't mean you bring in more people at the top, which is what everybody seems to do with federations, but instead of, you invest at the grassroots level. We've been talking about these things for years now, and I'm just hoping that now authorities will take notice, and hopefully these changes will come.
Now, of course, you've mentioned all the other reasons why Test cricket is not doing as well as it's doing in T20. But don't you think that since the departure of Misbah-ul Haq and Yunus Khan, there have been things going wrong with Pakistan in Test cricket? And what do you think more needs to be done to revive the excellent 5-day cricket performances?
Well, again, you have to put this into perspective. Misbah had a couple of years to work with the team. That was quite average, even when he took over. In fact, it was in deep trouble. And Misbah was a very senior statesman. He had a fantastic support, role played by Yunus Khan in terms of being a leader for the team. Right now, the most experienced guy, or the two most experienced people in our Test team, are Azhar Ali and Sarfraz. And Sarfraz, who was the darling of Pakistan cricket just a year ago when they won the Champions Trophy, is now suddenly the biggest villain. I think our fans tend to get a bit overexcited about the potential of this team. Test cricket, ODIs, these are teams that develop over 1 or 2 years at least. Guys like Asad Shafiq, Azhar Ali should have stepped forward, but for the future, I see people like Babar Azam. I mean, Babar Azam has been a phenomenal find for Pakistan cricket, and I think he will eventually become the backbone of this Test side. But I still feel that we are at least 2 years away from becoming a Test side that can give the big teams a run for their money. ODIs, I honestly believe that in England, Pakistan will actually be a team, the dark horses, the underdogs that can always cause an upset, and we tend to do well in England. So I've got my fingers crossed for the World Cup.
Well, the fingers are crossed. And now talking about the World Cup coming next year, do you think that Pakistan is really prepared for the round-robin tournament, and are the players mentally prepared for the challenge?
Actually, I believe that Pakistan are one of the best tournament sides in the world. We're not as good when it comes to bilateral series, but when it comes to tournament cricket, Pakistan are fantastic. If you look at our record, people tend to focus on the Pakistan-India record where we fail quite miserably. But other than that, if you look at our win percentages and the fact that we've made semi-finals at least since the start of the 50-over World Cup or the ODI World Cup, we've pretty much almost, other than maybe 1 or 2 occasions where we crashed out, we've been in the hunt for the trophy and, a final as well as a victory, of course. I think this team is something that can deliver. Maybe I'm being a bit optimistic that they'll be able to, pull something out of the hat in the summers. But for sure, I think give them another year, and the Asia Cup will be fairly easy. I think Pakistan-India rivalry is bound to restart, and once that happens, cricket will become great again. It's the other sports that we need to worry about.
Rightly said. Now, Umar, you mentioned about the other sports other than cricket, which are being neglected in Pakistan. Now, will the fate of particularly Pakistan hockey change in the coming year? And why is the government not paying any attention to the deteriorating conditions of hockey?
I think the government historically hasn't paid attention to pretty much anything across the board. I get a lot of players coming on my show and complaining about the fact that the government doesn't help. And I asked them the same thing, that do you expect the government or government departments to help you, in any other thing in life? And usually the answer is no. And I said, if you don't expect them to help you with simple things which they're supposed to provide, how do you think they can provide for you in sports? We have sports federations that are top heavy, lots of people enrolled like any other government organization. I think the majority of their budgets are eaten up by HR costs. Our hockey team needs private, sponsors who come through for the sake of the love of sport to help them go to these tournaments. Most of the time, 6 months our hockey players went unpaid. 6 months,
Wow.
which is absolutely insane. And it keeps happening all the time. And the Hockey Federation, they keep changing the people at the top. It's not just the Hockey Federation. Hockey Federation has always been political, and since it became political, it's become a disaster. But you have other federations who are really working very, very hard. Football is not one of them for sure. They've been a long-term disaster under the same management, same people at the top who have absolutely ruined any chance of football becoming big in Pakistan. Clubs like Karachi United and a couple of other clubs in Lahore and across Pakistan are trying on their own, but really none of them will ever attribute the Football Federation for having helped them.
Thank you very much for joining us. That was Umar Ghaznavi, sports analyst. He was discussing and reviewing the year 2018 in terms of sports in Pakistan and the deteriorating conditions of different sports other than cricket. And that's all we have on the show tonight. Join us again tomorrow and we will take you beyond the news.